Also wanted to take a minute today to talk through some of part 3 of your biblical interpretation assignment. For each of the classes, we would have touched on this a little bit, but I want to make sure that you have a pretty solid understanding of what it is that I'm looking for. This is graded more heavily. This is weighted more heavily than the other two sections of your biblical interpretation assignment. Each one of those was worth 5 points for your total grade of 20. And this one, this final section is worth 10 points of your final grade of 20. I do that because this is the section that is really heavy on research and that is really heavy on answers, on really getting to a place where you finally can say, based on my research, this is what this passage is trying to tell me. This is going to be something that you have to spend some time with. And so I wanted to make sure that I got this kind of in front of you as quickly as possible as far as this part of the semester is concerned. So you have several options for how you go about this. And each of those is going to be dependent on what your question actually is. So I really want to encourage you to take some time to meet with me in the weeks to come, just to make sure that that you have a good question with which to work, and that you have enough that you can actually do with that kind of question. So, for instance, as I walked through this passage from Habakkuk, this is what I was actually referencing in this previous example. As I walk through that section, I look at chapter 2, verse 4, and you can see over here in my section 2, I asked this question already. Are pride and righteousness truly antithetical? And it actually is something that comes from what I observed over here. So as I walked through all of my questions that I had asked for this entire part 2, I finally thought, you know what? That would be an interesting question for me to deal with. So this is the question, and when you turn in this assignment, you're going to go ahead and get rid of all of this and just start with your question. Whatever your question is that you had in your section 2, go and put that question up there, and then say from John chapter whatever, verse whatever. And then as you walk through this, you have these different options for how you're going to tackle this part of the assignment. So you have different methods of research that you can walk through. So first of all, I want to talk through each of these. First of all, your literary context. As you look in the literary context, what you're trying to check out is specifically within your book. So you're looking at the Gospel of John, and specifically within the Gospel of John, what does it say that can help me to better understand what Jesus is saying right here, or what the apostles are asking, or whatever it is that is being tackled in your question. You want to look in the rest of the Gospel of John and see, what does all of this tell me about my question? So you may be looking at John 1, and you say, okay, this says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And maybe your question is, okay, who is the Word? And so if you were to look through the rest of the Gospel of John, maybe the fact that it focuses on Jesus for the rest of the book tells you that the Word's identity is Jesus Christ. Maybe the fact that you can look and say, the Word was with God and the Word was God, makes you look at Jesus' statements where he identifies himself as the divine figure. Maybe all of that makes you go, well then I'm assuming that the Word is God. All of these can kind of help us to understand from within the book itself a little bit more of what's going on. Second thing there is scriptural testimony. And this differs from the literary context in the sense that initially you were just looking at the Gospel of John. And now you're going to expand that out to all of the Bible, every piece of Scripture that exists, you can look at all of that and see how it informs what you are understanding from the passage that you're trying to address. So maybe you're able to pull some stuff from Genesis. Maybe you're able to pull some stuff from Revelation and everything in between. You can use all of that to help you better understand this question. Martin Luther said that Scripture interprets Scripture. And so that's part of what we do when we are going through texts like this. We're looking at the breadth of the biblical tradition, and we're looking at it to say, I think this is the significance of this question. Then we look at inflections and syntax. How does some of the language that's in this passage that you're dealing with help you to better understand the answer to your question? So I don't necessarily have an example of this in here because part of my study at this time was not necessarily involved with that. And again, I say, you may look at your text and say, I don't really think this has anything to do with what I'm trying to study. And that's okay. I don't expect you to pull from every single one of these. But all of these are kind of the tools in the toolbox that may help you along the way. So, how does the language in the passage help you better understand this question? Well, again, I say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, that tells us that the Word is somehow separate from, somehow distinct from the Father, and yet is somehow one with the Father. And it's part of how we develop Trinitarian language in the first place. So if I'm looking at John 1, and I'm trying to answer the question of who the Word is, well, then I'm going to say that apparently, based on the language in the passage, the Word is somehow distinct from and yet part of God, which would tell me that he's part of the Godhead. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we use that inflections and syntax piece. The next thing we've got there is the tone or the atmosphere. What is it about the passage, and I've used this before, what is it about this text that makes you go, oh, I think just the general tone helps me to better understand what's going on. So for instance, if you're trying to interpret a passage and you look at it and just the little verse that you're looking at looks like it's super, super sad. But when you have read the passage itself, when you've read the whole piece of it, it seems like it's a very happy passage. Well, that's probably something that tells you that your interpretation needs to change a little bit. One of the things that happens a lot, one of the ways in which this shows up would be something like the book of Lamentations. Lamentations, you may have heard of a lament. And a lament is really just kind of a cry of sorrow. And if you're looking at Lamentations and you are you're interpreting it as some sort of really happy thing, well, it's probably wrong. Because the whole point of Lamentations was to express the writer's sorrow. So, that's kind of how we use the tone or the atmosphere. You also want to look at the author's purpose and their viewpoint. Specifically, what is the goal that the author has in writing this book? If you're looking at the Gospel of John and his whole goal is to basically demonstrate Christ's divinity, then it may be that helps you to better understand why some story is included in the text. And it may help you to understand a little bit more about your question. So when you look at the author's purpose and viewpoint, we're looking specifically at why did John write this letter? Why did John write this gospel? And if he had a specific reason in mind, which he did, then how does that reasoning tell me a little bit more about why this passage shows up? Next thing there is a historical background. And this is one of those that's really going to require some research from you. What in the ancient world could help you better grasp the answer to your question? So in class, I think I used the example of the church in Ephesus. There are different times where Paul will say things that seem like they are discouraging women from being in ministry. And there are churches to this very day that will teach that women should not be in ministry. There are other churches that will say that women should be in ministry. And part of what helps us to better understand why Paul wrote the things that he did is the historical background. If you look and you start to research, then you see that when Paul wrote things like, I do not permit a woman to hold authority over a man, he was writing specifically to the church in Ephesus. It shows up in multiple letters, but in every one of those, if you actually look at where he's writing to the church in Ephesus. Timothy, for example, was serving the church in Ephesus at the time that Paul wrote this to him. And when we start to understand a little bit more about the historical background, we find that that Ephesus was the epicenter of a female-led cult in the Roman Empire. And a lot of these women were coming straight out of this cult and going into the church and thinking that they could just kind of speak out and prophesy and do whatever they wanted to do because they had always been the ones who held authority in that particular cult. So when Paul says, I do not permit a woman to hold authority over a man, first of all, he doesn't use language that would lend to the idea that he's saying, I do not ever permit any woman anywhere to hold authority over a man. But he also seems to be addressing specifically the Ephesian community. So that would lend to the idea that perhaps women are allowed to be in ministry. So we look at these kinds of things and we start to pull the text apart and we start to look at why certain things were written in the first place. And that helps us to better understand our passage in general. So we certainly want to go for a natural reading of the passage, but our historical background can also help us to understand why these things were written in the first place. Second to last thing there is the history of the tradition. What do ancient theologians say about this? You can check out ccel.org. The Christian Classics Ethereal Library is what that is. And it goes through, and you can actually type in whatever passage it is that you're dealing with, and it'll pull up a lot of the records of some of the ancient theologians that talked about this particular topic. You may get writings from John Calvin. You may get writings from John Wesley. Those are more recent. But you also may get writings from Augustine or Origen or Chrysostom or any of these guys that were real heavy hitters in the ancient church. Really, as long as it's more than probably 200 years old, we would consider that to be a part of the history of the tradition. If you're going from about the 1800s on, that would still be considered something more of the modern era as far as our scholarship is concerned. So what do the ancient theologians have to say about this particular passage? That can be really, really helpful. Because if you consider a lot of these guys who were part of the church in the 200s or 300s were actually the ones who were closer to the culture in which these things were written and can give us a little more insight into why these things are significant. And then finally, the interpretation of others, modern scholars. We want to look at things like commentaries. And if you haven't necessarily seen a commentary before, I'm not expecting you to have. Commentaries will focus specifically on one book of the Bible for in a lot of cases. Sometimes you can get whole Bible commentaries, but they're actually not quite as useful to you as a specific book is probably going to be. So for instance, on my shelf right now, I have a book that's about this thick that deals specifically with the Gospel of John. And that writer goes in and just kind of pulls that text apart and says, based on our current understanding, based on the manuscripts that we have, based on the original language, all of those things, this is why we think this passage means what it does. So check all of those things out. And then finally, you want to look at the synthesis. Finally, after you have gone through and given all of your points of evidence and what you think they mean, you want to synthesize all of that information into a single paragraph. Basically, and this is from parts 1, 2, and 3. So from your entire biblical interpretation assignment, give me about a paragraph or two. I don't necessarily think you have to be that brief with it if you need to get into more detail. But based on all of this work that I've done, this is what I think this passage is trying to say. And this is what I think the answer to this question is. If you are going through this, you will probably have, if you do this well, you will probably have at least 20 different points that you can talk about in answering your question. So, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And you have the opportunity to meet with me as you see fit. And I'll talk to you soon.